this lecture, I am going to introduce two prominent military theorists who wrote about the essence of war in the 19th century. The first was Antoine de Germany in the picture on the top left, and the second was Karl von Clausewitz in the picture on the bottom left. Now, before one studies specific wars in human history, it's important to first think about what war is conceptually, and also perhaps about what war is not. It's also important to understand how people have thought about war across time, because those ideas and approaches have defined how people have thought about war, and certainly how they have approached war and waged war into the modern era. Now, when studying military theory and the history of war, the first thing to understand is that people tend to put war conceptually in two separate boxes. Now, this is an oversimplification, as we'll discuss, but you have to start with the simple and then get complex. The first school of thought is that war is a science. So if one wants to understand war, they have to approach it like one would approach any science. You break it down, you understand its component parts, and you quote-unquote put it back together again to generate effective theory, and if one is a military practitioner, effective military practice. Jomini falls in this school very generally. This school of thought, that war is a science, really arose in the late 18th and into the 19th century, because this was created by two revolutionary movements that existed and really came into full fruition in, as I said, the late 18th and into the 19th centuries. And those were the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. If you're not familiar with the Scientific Revolution, this was a movement that actually began a little bit further back in the 1500s, and it involved scholars, originally most of them were members of the clergy, starting to observe the natural world and generate hypotheses about why things in the natural world were the way that they were. So very basic scientific principles like the scientific method and observation, forming theories based upon observation and not upon myth or some type of unprovable belief. All of that was born during the Scientific Revolution. The Scientific Revolution mostly involved studying the stems, things like chemistry, physics, the universe, trying to understand the movement of the planets and what the solar system was like. Mathematics, these types of things were the main focus of the Scientific Revolution. And as I said, it began as a movement mostly led by members of the clergy, but once it came into maturity in the 1700s, there were a lot of secular scholars who were contributing to this revolutionary era. The Scientific Revolution soon transitioned into another revolutionary movement called the Enlightenment, and these things started to coexist at the same time, so it's not like scientific development stopped when the Enlightenment started, but the Enlightenment was about taking these principles of observation, of understanding the component parts of things, the scientific method, those basic approaches, and applying them to more abstract concepts. So things like politics, human nature, human rights. What is the mind? What is the intellect? What does a government owe to the people? What do people owe to a government? Is that a mutually beneficial relationship? Do governments have the right to control what people do? Turning to human nature, is human nature inherently good? Is it inherently fallible? What's the relationship between human nature and society? Even things like the nature of economics and basic fundamental economic principles. All of these things were developed during the Enlightenment. And so you have these two schools that come together and form this idea that war, like anything else, is a science. Because during the Enlightenment, there was this idea that everything could be broken down into its component parts, as I've said. So not just the stems, but also human nature and biology and just all of these abstract things like politics and economics, etc., etc. And if you can break down human nature into sort of scientifically studyable parts, then war is the same. War's just more of the same. This is when we have the explosion of the encyclopedic movement, where people started creating encyclopedias. And that's what an encyclopedia does, right? It breaks things down definitionally, defines things, at least they attempt to define things very clearly and concisely. And so war was just viewed as a subset of that general movement. And that's the school that Jomini was in, this gentleman on the top left. And we'll talk about him in more detail in a moment. Because he, generally speaking, falls into this school of theorists that treated war and treat war as a science, the theories that they generated and continue to generate are what we call prescriptive theories. So they are trying to prescribe proper action, proper behavior. And when we're talking about war, prescriptive theory is theory that attempts to point out to military practitioners how can they achieve success. So this is where you get modern military manuals, for example, that lay out exactly what to do in specific circumstances in order to operate effectively and then eventually achieve success. And Jomini was really the pioneer of that school in the modern sense into the 19th century. He was a rock star, as we'll see. He was widely known and admired for his many, many works of prescriptive military theory. So traditionally speaking, Jomini has been considered the main figure in the war as a science school. The other school treats war as an art, and this is the school that Clausewitz falls into. Karl von Clausewitz felt that war was far too complex and complicated to be broken down into component parts like any other science could be. And he and military theorists in his school actually create what we might call descriptive works of theory, where they aren't trying to prescribe proper action necessarily. They're trying to get at the essence of what war is. And Clausewitz was in the War is an Art school as a result of two movements in the 19th century, one being the Enlightenment, which I just described, but also a movement called Romanticism, which was a response in some ways to the Enlightenment movement. Again, the Enlightenment was about taking scientific theory and approach and applying them to abstract ideas, that everything is able to be categorized and cataloged and put into an encyclopedia and defined. Romanticism was a rebuttal to that, and Romantics argued that no, not everything can be easily categorized, that human nature and emotion were some of the things that were far too variable, far too complex, too complicated, too nebulous to be easily categorized as though they were a science. And that's the school Clausewitz fits in. He was more part of this Romantic school because a lot of his work is about what the essence of war is, while also acknowledging that inherently there are things we can just never quite understand or predict about war. Now, Clausewitz and Jomini don't easily fit into these two categories, as we'll see. There's actually quite a lot of overlap between them, because a lot of Romantics still want to impact military theory and military practice, and so there are elements of prescriptive theory in War is an Art theorists' work. There's also descriptive elements in the War is a Science school. So generally speaking, these are basic categories in opposition. If you think war is a science at its core, then you can't necessarily think war is an art and vice versa. But in reality, most theorists overlap in these two schools. But generally speaking, if we're going to put this in simplest terms, these are two schools in opposition. School 1 says that war is a science, and School 2 says war is an art. Now, to understand a little bit more about what all this means, and what exactly Jomini said about war and what Clausewitz said about war. First, we have to understand them as people, and then we can dive into their theories. So let's do that now. In order to understand the ideas and the theories posited by Antoine de Germany, we have to understand his background and life experiences because they heavily influenced what he wrote and what he believed about the nature and conduct of war. Now, a fascinating thing about Antoine de Germany is that if you were someone in the 19th century and through World War II, if you studied military theory, if you were an academic or in a military and studied military theory, if you wrote military theory, if you were a practitioner and tried to understand best practice, if you worked in a government and had any influence on military and political policy, or if you were just an academic and intellectual who studied historical events as they pertain to war, you would have known who Jomini was. The irony is that in his own lifetime and through World War II, he was a rock star. And that may seem like a silly thing to say, but he was a widely celebrated intellectual in Europe, in the United States, actually throughout the rest of the world, in circles of people who studied war, studied politics, military affairs, etc., etc. But the irony is that most people in those spheres today would have very little to no idea who Jomini was. He's starting to have a little bit of a renaissance, as it were, in military circles, but he was mostly forgotten after World War II in favor of Clausewitz, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. But Jomini actually is considered one of the paramount military theorists of the modern era. And in fact, he's considered by some to be the father of modern operational art. He was a theorist of strategy. He dealt with strategy, tactics, logistics, grand strategy, the relationship between militaries and their governments. He dealt with all of that. And he also reflected upon broader theories of war. So he wasn't just prescriptive, although most of his work was prescriptive. He did make some attempts at descriptive approaches to war. So again, mostly in the School 1, War as a Science, but dabbled in the war as an art school as well. But this is the irony, is he's considered the father of modern operational art. Anyone who was anyone that studied military theory through World War II would have known who he was, and yet after World War II he sort of fell to the wayside as Clausewitz ascended in military schools and consideration amongst theorists. Jomini was Swiss. He was born in 1779, so he was the product of the French Revolutionary era, and that is going to have a huge impact on his life. He was from not a noble family, but a very well-to-do family. His father was in business, and they were prosperous, so part of a proto-middle class, as it were. So this meant that he had some latitude in terms of what he could do with his life. He actually went to business school at 14, and he graduated in 1795, and he became a banker in Switzerland. He then went to Paris for a short period of time before returning to Switzerland, but from a very young age we know he had an intense interest in military history and military affairs. So although he was trained as a businessman, he was trained as a banker and went to school to do that, he had a deep interest in military affairs. And so he was very studious because he was schooled at a young age and was capable of being schooled at an advanced level at a young age. And he had this military interest, and this is the era of the French Revolution. It's the revolutionary era, and those things would combine to deeply influence his life. When the French invaded territory that would become Switzerland, it wasn't Switzerland at the time, it would become Switzerland later, the Swiss decided to follow the French revolutionary model and create a new independent Swiss republic. Jomini was there, he was interested in getting involved, and so he actually joined the Swiss Ministry of War because he wanted to help shape it. He wanted to create a more modern military system, a more modern republican government, because he was very partial to and a partisan of this French revolutionary idea. In 1801, he decided to go back to Paris because that was really the center of the European intellectual movement into the 19th century. The Enlightenment was taking place throughout Europe, but two really big centers of intellectual development during the Enlightenment were in France, specifically Paris, but also in England, in Britain more generally, in London, but also in Edinburgh. It became a really prominent location of the Enlightenment as well. But because he was interested in the intellectual side of military affairs, he had wanted to shape the Swiss Ministry of War after all, he wanted to go to Paris to sort of be where the happenings were. He wanted to be there to get involved. And so he moved back to Paris. He'd been there for a short period of time before, as I said. He moved back and he got a job with a military equipment manufacturer. So that was his day job, was participating in what would become the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. They didn't know that at the time, but that was what he was getting involved in, which is why later in his life he would write about the influence of industrialization upon war. In his free time, he started writing, and he wrote a lot. He wrote all the time, just about military practice and military theory and what was best practice to achieve success. And this was what led him to his big break, so to speak. He wrote something about military theory, and this was handed person to person and eventually made it into the hands of one of Napoleon's favorite generals, a general named Michel Ney. And Ney was, as I said, one of Napoleon's favorite generals. He wasn't quite there at this point because Napoleon hadn't quite had his full ascendancy by 1801, but he was getting there quite quickly. And Ney was one of his right-hand men, one of his most favorite generals. And when Ney read this treatise that had been written by Jomini, he thought that Jomini really had something, that he understood warfare and had some really good ideas. And so Ney actually sponsored this pamphlet to be published and widely distributed. And very, very quickly, Jomini became famous for this work about the art of war that he had written and had been widely published. And so he became sort of part of the creme de la creme of the Enlightenment society within Paris and within the French Revolutionary, transitioning into the Napoleonic government because he had the favor of Michel Ney. Because of his newfound fame, so to speak, very quickly Ney offered Jomini a position on his general staff. This means that Jomini was given a commission in the French army, and then he was made an officer and put on Ney's general staff. And this might seem strange because Jomini was Swiss after all. He was not French, but this was actually fairly common in the early modern into the modern era for people from one country to serve in the military of another country. Might seem strange to us now, actually relatively common at the time. General staffs were these body of officers that would serve directly under a general in an army. This system was created by the Prussians in the 18th century, and it became so effective that pretty much every military in Europe and then in the rest of the world slowly adopted the general staff system. So even into the modern era, in modern militaries around the world, you have general staffs. And these staffs are comprised of officers of varying ranks, and they do all kinds of things for the general that they're on the staff of. They might write letters, carry correspondence, they might help transport supplies for the general, and they serve as a brain trust sometimes of sorts, where a general might want feedback on certain decisions, and the general staff can provide that. Usually it depends on the general or even the admiral, depending upon the rank of the individual. But Jomini was wanted for his intellectual ability and his innovative ideas about warfare. So he was given this commission, and he began to serve in the French army. Now, he never directly commanded troops in battle, but because he was attached to Ney, and at one point he even was directly attached to Napoleon, he was in the theater of war where Napoleon was active through most of his most famous campaigns. One of the most famous battles that Napoleon won was a battle called Austerlitz. Jomini was at that battle. He was also in Spain when the French engaged in a guerrilla war in Spain in an attempt to conquer the country so that Napoleon could put a member of his family on the throne of Spain. The war there was very violent. This is where we get the term guerrilla, and Jomini was there to witness that. He also participated in the French invasion of Russia, so he was present for that as well. But because he was Swiss, this gave him a special status. Again, he never directly commanded troops in battle, and at one point he was actually offered a commission in the Russian military. And this might seem strange for someone to hold commission in two militaries at the same time, but he being a member of a general staff, him being Swiss, the fact that he was considered this internationally celebrated military theorist, this allowed him to have this somewhat special status. There were some members of the French military that didn't like Jomini because he held this dual status, but he made it work because, again, everybody appreciated his intelligence and his capability because he's publishing all the while. He's writing treatises, he's writing books about military tactics and strategy and the history of warfare, and he's publishing book after book or treatise after treatise, and as I said, he was very popular. Napoleon was, of course, exiled at one point. And so, having been such a supporter of the Republican system, and then a supporter of Napoleon, and a supporter of the Swiss Republican system back in his own country, he did not want to stay in France when Napoleon was exiled. There was also some fear about some criminal charges, but that was very unlikely. He wanted to take a new opportunity because of Napoleon's exile, and so he decided to join the Russian army. So he formally took up his commission in the Russian army, and he would actually stay in the Russian army for the rest of his career. Now again, he never commanded troops in battle. He would serve on general staffs, he would serve in military academies, he would serve in the Ministry of War. His job was as a military theorist and as a military advisor. Now, of course, because he went to the Russians, there were a lot of French officers, already those who had not been too disposed to him before, who viewed this as traitorous because he went to the Russians. But because of his status as a theorist, in general, people just sort of overlooked this. He became a direct military aide for a time to Tsar Alexander I, but again, he refused to command troops in battle, never did, even denied the opportunity when it was offered to him. Alexander offered to allow him to command troops in battle when the Russians started to move back towards France in an effort to suppress Napoleon, and he turned down that offer. However, he was a military attaché at the Congress of Vienna, so he's really at the front lines of all of these really big, important military events during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic era. In a direct sense, he's not intervening because he's not commanding troops in battle, but he's serving on general staffs, he's at these battles, he's in these governments, he's watching what's going on. He actually, for a time, tutored Tsar Nicholas I, a direct military tutor. Tsars in waiting, kings in waiting, queens in waiting would have lots and lots of tutors who specialized in different things, and so he served as a tutor for a time, also tutored Alexander II, and then he helped found the Russian Staff College. So the Russians were a little bit behind on adopting what at the time was considered modern military practice, which had been, as I said, pioneered by the Russians, the staff system, and colleges, military academies where you would train officers to go into this staff system. The Russians didn't really have one. Because Jomini was there, he helped found it and organize it. He actually served in the Russo-Turkish War. Again, he was a general. He served on staffs as an advisor, not directly commanding troops in battle. And he was an advisor to the Tsar during the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. So again, always there, impacting decision-making, but never actually directly commanding troops. To supplement his income, officers made an income, but depending upon how wanted to live, that income would vary in suitability. So Jomini, because he was this celebrated military theorist, he went around and gave speeches, he gave talks, he would visit military academies and serve as a visiting professor of sorts, what we would call him today. And he would visit kings, he visited emperors and empresses and courts, and so because he's traveling around, that is a very expensive lifestyle. So in order to supplement his income, he published, and he wrote over 20 books in his lifetime. In addition to these books, he wrote a lot of treatises, sort of like pamphlets, what we might call them today, which were very popular in the 19th century. And they were widely read and widely studied. And he wrote both histories and theoretical works. So he wrote stuff about the Napoleonic Wars because he was present and knew a lot about what had happened in the French government and the French military and Napoleon's decision-making. He'd had a front seat to that, so he wrote a lot about that. He also wrote works of theory, talking about proper tactics, proper strategy. He wrote about logistics and how militaries need to organize themselves in order to be effective. So here you have this individual that has a lot of direct life experience for the most part, never commanding troops himself, but being present while all of that decision making was taking place. He served in various militaries, 3 technically, the Swiss, the French, and the Russians, and he wrote prolifically about military theory, so much so that he was the premier military theorist of the 19th century. So as I said, he was widely read and admired throughout his lifetime, and perhaps just as importantly as being admired, his work was heavily studied at military academies, first in Europe and then in the United States, and then in any other military systems around the world that were trying to adopt the same methodologies that were used in Europe and the United States. He was the premier military theorist. And in fact, when historians study the American Civil War, for example, they often argue that you have to look at the actions of, say, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, 2 very important generals in the American Civil War, that you have to look at their decision-making, the tactics and strategy that they employed through the lens of having studied Jomini, because they both went to the military academy at West Point. They heavily studied Jomini at West Point. They still do read Jomini to some degree at West Point today, although he is not nearly as heavily studied today as he was. But, as I said, historians often argue that you really can't understand the American Civil War if you don't read Jomini, because a lot of the decisions that generals were making, not just the 2 that I mentioned, were influenced by their tutelage in Jominian tactics and strategy. Jomini lived a long life, and this is one reason that he was able to remain as prominent as he was for as long as he did, because he lived a long time, he traveled widely, he spoke a lot in different military academies and to different governments and different, presidents and kings and emperors, etc., and he published a lot, and he was able to maintain his prominence, as I said, in part because of that. In particular, he was able to be considered the premier military theorist into the 20th century, as opposed to Clausewitz, who's more celebrated today because of his long life, because he outlived Clausewitz, and that allowed him to have the last word, as it were, although Clausewitz is, as I said, more celebrated and widely read today. Jomini published a lot, as I've mentioned, but his most famous work is The Art of War, that he first published in 1838, although he updated it several times because it was one of the most famous books that he wrote. I would say his other most popular was his writing about Napoleon, probably not too much of a surprise, but The Art of War was translated into a lot of languages, and this was the primary text that people would study in military academies or in governments when they wanted to understand warfare. He had a deep understanding, as I've mentioned, of the French Revolution, of Napoleon, and something else I haven't mentioned yet is that he also really understood how industrialization impacted warfare. He lived through the Industrial Revolution. He saw firsthand how industrialization impacted warfare. And so he was able to contemplate that and think about that and write about that, so that when wars started happening in the later decades of the 19th century that were really transformed in a lot of ways by industrialization, he could write on that because he saw it firsthand. He was a prescriptive writer. At heart, in many ways, he viewed war as a science. Perhaps a better way to say it is that he viewed most of war practitionally as a science, but that the inherent nature of war was that of an art. But by and large, he felt that war could be reduced to a set of principles. And he could provide, because of his vast military experience and his studying of other military practitioners and theorists, he could provide solutions to tangible, known military problems. So in other words, an ABCs of sorts for how to effectively wage war, what type of problems one's going to encounter in war, and how to deal with those problems. And then he set about informing, if not creating, in Russia, an educational system, a model for education of officers, so that officers could be educated effectively in these set of principles and then how to solve the problems created in war. So superficially, most of his work was very, very prescriptive. And this is why it was widely studied at military academies, because this was something that teachers could use to teach students who will be future officers in militaries how to properly and effectively engage in warfare. Something else he's really well known for that serious military practitioners today and serious students of military history really appreciate, and that's logistics. He created the term logistics. Logistics is a term that refers to the organization of supplies and manpower for war. And it's one of those things that traditionally has been really overlooked by authors and military theorists because it's sort of boring. It's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of coordination, something that industrial engineers or people in business might concentrate on, the organization and how to plan everything out. But logistics are incredibly important to the success of militaries. It's just that people didn't pay too much attention to it before the modern era. But Jomini was responsible for identifying logistics as a concrete thing that military practitioners, and then by extension military theorists, people that studied war more abstractly, something they needed to pay attention to. And he demonstrated its importance, the importance of organizing supply, how important supply was and organizing manpower to the effectiveness in militaries, and he wrote about that. And so over time, that's probably been one of his more lasting legacies, because the importance of logistics to effective military operations is universal, regardless of what type of manpower and supplies one is organizing. In addition to his discussion of logistics, more generally, Jomini argued that battle and war are separate from politics. So they're not part of politics, they're not a tool of politics. Politics is in one box and war and battles are in another. And the idea was that they did not overlap, and so political figures should not influence war, and then potentially military figures should not form political policy. They might inform it, but they shouldn't form it themselves. So the idea was that these are two separate entities that did not overlap. He argued that there were maxims that applied to all wars, so rules that applied to all wars. It didn't matter where the war was fought, who was fighting the war, the reasons for the war being fought, or the technology they were using to wage war. There were maxims that applied to all wars, so Jomini argued, and thus if one could master those maxims, one could be proficient at waging war. This is the heart of prescriptive ideology. If one thinks war is a science, war can be broken down into maxims, and if one can learn those maxims and master those maxims, one can be proficient at waging war. And so although, as I've said, there were elements of war is an art in Jomini's ideas, and we've already talked about some of those, and we'll continue to address a few more here, at the heart of things, Jomini believed that one could learn the maxims of war and thus be proficient at war. Specifically, he wrote that war consisted of 5 principal parts, and that successful militaries found a way to balance these 5 elements. The first is strategy, and this refers to broader decision-making about broader movements and approaches to waging war. Grand tactics, so tactical decision-making about what type of tactics to use on the battlefield, but think a little bit more abstract. What type of broad tactical approaches one is going to use when waging war. Number 3 is logistics. Again, surprising that logistics would be on any list that a military theorist in the 19th century would create. Number 3, putting it pretty high, but that's why one reason I should say that Jomini is so well known in military circles, at least in the 19th century. Tactics of the different arms. So this is more in reference to tactics on the battlefield, say, or in naval combat. The specific tactics one was going to employ, using different technologies, different weapons to achieve victory in battle or in wars more generally. And then 5, the art of the engineer. Jomini, again, by and large, approached war as a science. And the view in the 19th century was that the way to master the military arts was by breaking it down into its components. And the best way for a practitioner to do that was through the lens of engineering. So all officers who went to military academies that adopted the Prussian general staff system, that adopted the Jominian way of thinking, a lot of them adopted engineering focuses in their programs. So even if one wasn't going to quote-unquote major, because you have to think of military academies sort of like colleges, even if one wasn't going to quote-unquote major in engineering, they still had to take courses that would be the military version of engineering courses at an academic institution. And this is the same today. If you go to the military academy at West Point, every cadet is required to take a certain number of engineering courses. The thinking being that just the way of approaching engineering is the best way to approach learning to be a practitioner of war. He wrote, quote, "These principles prescribe offensive action to mass forces against weaker enemy forces at some decisive point if strategy is to lead to victory." So at the core of everything, Jomini felt that victory could be achieved in one very, very hard but seemingly simplistic way. The way that one could achieve victory was to amass their forces, so gather all their forces together, and commit those forces, mass forces, against a weaker enemy. So you don't want to fight an enemy that's stronger than you want to fight an enemy that's weaker than you. And you want to put those forces against your enemy at a decisive point. And the idea of a decisive point is that it's the best place to attack to achieve success. And what that decisive point might be might vary, but think about a long line where the line is weakest. That's where you want to amass your forces. Mass your forces where the enemy is weakest. Use the mass of your force to attack that weak point. And if you do it right, you can achieve victory. As I've said many times now, most of his writing provided tactical directions and operational directions for behavior in combat. So although there are more abstract arguments in his writing, particularly the art of war, or l'art de la guerre, although there are more abstract ruminations about the nature of war that, as we'll see, puts him more in line with Clausewitz, when you read Jomini very superficially, it seems very lockstep. It seems very prescriptive. It seems very superficial. It discusses how to move armies in the field, how to organize supply, how to coordinate operations effectively. It's a manual of sorts for effective military operation, and that's why he was admired so much, not only because he had good ideas, but because of the various experiences that he had had, particularly in observing Napoleon, because throughout the rest of the 19th century, even during Napoleon's successes and during his life, and certainly after he was exiled and then he died, everyone was trying to crack the code. What was it that Napoleon did that made him so overwhelmingly effective for the period of time that he was effective? And when he was successful, he was decisively successful. Everyone was trying to crack the code, and Jomini had been, had a front seat to all of that. And so because of that, he wrote about Napoleon, he wrote about tactics, and because he was viewed as being innovative and having great ideas, this is why he was widely read in his lifetime and thereafter. Transitioning away from Jomini, now let's discuss the military theorist that a lot of people feel is the diametric opposite to Jomini, and that is Karl von Clausewitz. Now, in many ways, it's unfair to place these two theorists at opposition to one another. A lot of people do that, though, and have done that when they study military theory. I, for example, did it at the outset of this lecture. In some ways, as we've seen and will see, that's not entirely fair. But in other ways, it is very fair, because remember, at heart, Jomini believed that war was composed of maxims that one could master and thus master effective warfare. Jomini wanted to create those types of maxims, but at the end of the day, he argued that warfare was too complex, it was too unpredictable, it was too nebulous and hard to define to actually be able to do that effectively. And in fact, at one point he even argued that by identifying very specific maxims, one was closing themselves off to alternate possibilities that could lead one to defeat in combat. But before we dive into Clausewitz's opinions on warfare, we have to talk about Clausewitz himself. Karl von Clausewitz was born in 1780 in Prussia, and at the time, Prussia was a kingdom that was in the Holy Roman Empire. Prussia was at the forefront of military development in the late early modern and into the modern era. I already mentioned the general staff system that was created by the Prussians. A big reason that the Prussians were so admired and so sophisticated was because they had a king named Frederick the Great, and Frederick the Great was one of the best military practitioners of the entire early modern era. Military theorists might argue he was one of the best generals that has ever lived, despite the fact he's not widely known outside military circles. Famously, Napoleon actually visited Frederick's tomb when he was in Prussia after a successful campaign. And Napoleon was said to take off his hat and told all of his staff officers and generals with him to pay respects to Frederick the Great, because he said, "Gentlemen, if he were still alive, we would not be here." i.e., if Frederick the Great were still alive, Napoleon would not have been able to beat the Prussians in battle. The Prussians had been so sophisticated for so long. This is why when the British were fighting the Americans in the American Revolution and they wanted to hire some mercenaries, the mercenaries that they hired, a lot of them were Prussians, or they were from small counties or principalities that bordered Prussia that had adopted the same military system that the Prussians did. So Clausewitz, born at the heart of military evolution and military change in Europe when he was born. He was also from a well-off family, very much like Jomini. The two men have a lot of similarities in their upbringing, in fact. The Clausewitzes claimed to be distant descendants of an older Prussian noble family, the von Clausewitzes. Whenever you see a German, or more specifically a Prussian name with a von in it, that's an indication of nobility, even though the nobility and the noble class were disbanded by the 20th century. So he used the von in his name, as his family had done, but there's actually no evidence that he was actually descended from Prussian nobility, but it helped him in his military career because the old Prussian aristocracy were considered sort of the bulwark of the Prussian military system. No one disputed these claims at the time. People do now. Fact is, we don't really know. There's no evidence either way, but that's why he has the von in his name. Sometimes you'll see his name spelled with K's. His name was not spelled with K's. That was something that was done in the 20th century to Germanize his name, but his name was spelled with C's. He was a wunderkind of sorts. He was very, very intelligent. He distinguished himself at a very young age, much like Jomini had done. And in fact, he began military service in 1792 at the age of 12. This is because from a very early age he went into formal military education. Effectively, he was in a middle school and high school that specialized in military education. That's the best way to refer to it now, although there's no accurate modern analog to the system that he was in at the time. But he was commissioned as a lance corporal in 1792 and showed his intelligence, as I said, from a young age and his interest in military affairs. He witnessed his first military campaign in 1790, obviously very young when he was at his first military campaign, and he was present for a lot of the Prussian campaigns against the French Revolutionary Army. So before Napoleon came to the fore in France, the Revolutionary Wars took place, where a lot of different countries in Europe tried to invade France or attack France to suppress the French Revolution because they felt that it would spread and that would cause a lot of problems for these traditional imperial governments or these traditional kingdoms, Prussia being one of them. And so the Prussians fought several campaigns against the French Revolutionary armies, and Clausewitz witnessed that. In particular, he was present at the Rhineland campaign, which were the series of campaigns in the Rhineland in 1793 that were particularly brutal. So he was introduced to the realities of warfare at a very, very young age. Prussian officers, remember, the Prussians are at the forefront of military education, and it was expected that Prussian officers not only were educated in their practice as being active officers, but they were also expected to semi-independently acquire what we today would call a liberal arts education. Actually, Napoleon was known for doing this, and he did this because he knew that this was part of the Prussian military education system. Napoleon read extensively about military history. He read extensively about poetry and philosophy and, all of these types of fields that we would consider in the liberal arts that would seemingly be in direct opposition to studying war. Well, Napoleon studied those things in his free time, and a big reason for him doing this, other than he was just interested, was because he knew this was a core component of the Prussian military education system. And because Clausewitz was intelligent and he was an avid reader, he generated a massive education in, as I said, philosophy, art, music, literature. He studied history extensively. Of course, big fan of Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great before him, just actually like Napoleon was. A lot of Prussian officers were, of course, extensively studied the campaigns of Frederick the Great. And this created a very rounded education, seemingly, as I said, antithetical to this engineering scientific approach that was much championed by Jomini. And there are a lot of military historians who would argue that this is a fundamental reason for the different approaches that they had to war, is that Jomini's education was very practical, observational, and he emphasized engineering and he emphasized, the sciences because he was in France during the heyday of the Enlightenment, whereas Clausewitz was in this system that not only championed those things, but also this liberal arts element that really influenced his thinking. He graduated from a military academy that was brand new that the Prussians had created called the Kriegsakademie in 1804, and it was very new at the time, as I said, and this was the premier military education institution in the early 19th century. It was the education, at least in part, at the Kriegsakademie that Jomini was trying to mirror when he created his college in Russia. Clausewitz also spent a lot of his free time thinking and writing about warfare. Based upon what we know about Clausewitz personally, and sadly we don't know too much because of his personality. From what we can tell, he seemed very quiet, liked to keep to himself. Today we might call him a loner, might be a word that we would use to describe Clausewitz. He read and wrote extensively. He had a very good relationship with his wife and respected her a lot, and they wrote to one another constantly when they were apart. And so we get an avenue into Clausewitz's personality and his thoughts that way. But the funny thing about him is that he became very well known in the late 19th century, and high-ranking military officers who would have been around Clausewitz when he was alive said much later, when he started to become important, that they knew about him and he sort of always was around, but nobody really paid too much attention to him because he was always sort of in the background, sort of quiet, observing a lot, but he never commanded troops in battle, and he always concentrated on studying the essence of war, reading and learning about warfare. And so this contributed to the fact that, as I've alluded to, and as I'll talk more about, he was not very well known at all in his own lifetime. His wife was named Marie Bruhl, and it is so thankful that he married her for many reasons. They had a very happy marriage, but also because when Clausewitz died, she actually took it upon herself to edit his book, his only book that he published on war, Vom Krieg. He died without it being completed, and he talked to her in person and through correspondence. We have this correspondence, both sides, so if you're interested in this, you can actually look up the letters and you can read them. They've been translated. He talked with her a lot about his theories of war and what he wanted on war to have in it, and the content and the arguments that he wanted to make, because he respected her quite a lot and valued very deeply her opinion. And so when he died, before he was able to finish Vom Krieg, she, as I said, took it upon herself to compile it, to edit it, and to get it published. And if she hadn't done that, we would never have On War. And given Clausewitz's importance to modern military theorists, that would be very unfortunate. Very similar to Jomini, Clausewitz served as a tutor also. He tutored the Prussian Prince August, and then when the Prussians went on campaign against the French in 1806, Clausewitz served as August's aide de camp. What this means is that when August went on campaign with the Prussian army, Clausewitz traveled with him, he helped with his correspondence, he continued to tutor him, he was his minder of sorts, his companion. What this also means is that when August was captured with some other Prussian officers in 1806 by Napoleon and the French, Clausewitz was captured as well. But because the French cared about August, here they have this Prussian prince that they can use in negotiating with the Prussians, they didn't care too much about Clausewitz. He was a mid-level Prussian aristocrat at best, and so although he was technically in captivity, he was given a lot of leeway. So he traveled around Paris, he did a lot of studying, and he did a lot of observing. He tried to observe the French, tried to figure out how they were training, what it was that they were doing that made them so successful. And that's really something that Clausewitz concentrated on during his captivity and then afterwards, is he joined this informal cadre of officers, and there were a lot of Prussian officers in this cadre, and also there were officers in the Russian military, the British military, pretty much everywhere in Europe. Everyone was trying to figure out what it was that the French were doing that made them so successful. From our point of view, it might not seem like too exceptional a thing that the French were doing so well. Napoleon is this enormous figure in European history and military history, and he was an exceptional military commander. So that the French were doing so well and that Napoleon was succeeding for the period of time that he was, might not in retrospect or in hindsight to us seem like that surprising of a thing, but we have to understand the world as they saw it, as they lived it. In the 18th century, the Prussians were at the forefront of military sophistication, capability, and development. If one wanted to understand the future of warfare as people thought it would be in 1800, 1805, most people would have thought that you needed to go to Prussia, and they had the most sophisticated military education system. The Kingdom of Prussia was not that big, but they were incredibly, incredibly strong. And so Clausewitz was trying to figure out how this sophisticated Prussian army that should have, from their point of view, easily defeated the French. How did they lose? Because also from the European point of view, the French Revolutionary Army was a bunch of citizen soldiers who didn't know what they were doing. And in the 18th century, more generally, the French Royal Army had really fallen behind in terms of people's respect for their capability and their ability to succeed. They lost several important wars in the 18th century, and so they weren't seen as a first-rate military power anymore. That was really the British and the Prussians. So how is it that the French Revolutionary armies could, they weren't winning one time or two times, they were winning again and again and again against European alliance after European alliance. And so Clausewitz was one of these people trying to figure out what on earth it was the French were doing that made them succeed. Now, unfortunately for Clausewitz's career, because of his time in France, he was viewed with some suspicion and skepticism when he went back to Prussia. The highest-ranking power brokers in the Prussian military felt that maybe he'd been in France a little bit too long, and so he was marginalized in a sense. He had been this up-and-comer, rising through the ranks pretty rapidly, and this sort of stalled his career. His career stalled, as it were, even more in 1812 because he left the Prussian army. Of course, he'd spent all of his formative years in the Prussian army, but he did this because he strongly objected to the decisions that the Prussian state and the Prussian military were making. By 1812, the Prussians had been defeated by Napoleon so thoroughly that Napoleon forced the Prussians into a military alliance. Now, the Prussians were diametrically opposed to the French, not well disposed to them. So this was certainly something that grated on almost all Prussian officers at the time. But the Prussians really had no choice. They were forced into the alliance because they had just been defeated that badly by Napoleon. On top of this alliance, Napoleon forced the Prussians to contribute troops to his invasion of Russia. So now not only were the Prussians forced into this seemingly shameful alliance from their point of view, but they were also being forced to now support Napoleon's campaigns of conquest into Russia. And a lot of Prussians objected to this, but the Prussian state felt it had no choice. Clausewitz and other officers felt the Prussians certainly did have a choice, that they didn't need to do this. And so not only did he withdraw from the Prussian army, but then he went with several other Prussian officers and joined the Russian army. So although Clausewitz and Jomini never met, again, following in some ways similar paths. Now, Clausewitz, very much also like Jomini, was present at a lot of battles, but was not a commander in the field. So Clausewitz did command troops at the Battle of Borodino, a very big, important battle during the French invasion of Russia in 1812. So he witnessed that battle from the Prussian side, not the winning side, which was the French-Prussian side, strange as that sounds. But so he was there and he observed it because he was basically a general staff officer in the Russian army when he got his commission. Then in 1813, he joined what was called the Russian-German Legion, which was a special legion in the Russian army made up of Germanic soldiers, mostly Prussian soldiers, who had done exactly what Clausewitz did. They left the Prussian army because they refused to fight with the French against the Russians. Now, this isn't because the Prussians and the Russians had this really great relationship. They didn't. It was because they hated the French. So he joined formally this legion, and he did not, again, directly command troops in battle. His big contribution is that as Napoleon's power was waning, he was actually able to negotiate with the Prussian commanders attached to the French and get them to defect from the Napoleonic army, either to just go back to Prussia or to turn and start supporting Russian military endeavors. And he was instrumental in this because obviously as a Prussian himself, he knew a lot of the Prussian commanders that were actually in the field commanding troops against the Russians, and this really helped contribute to Napoleon's defeat. By 1815, this Russian-German Legion, again an entire legion of Prussian troops that were in the Russian army, they were then reintegrated into the Prussian army. And Clausewitz was at Waterloo. So he was a staff officer. He was an advisor to a Prussian general. At Waterloo, he observed Waterloo, or might arguably be better to say that he arrived at Waterloo somewhat late with the rest of the Prussian force that arrived late in the battle. But so again, very much like Jomini, he's not directly commanding troops himself, but he's on the front lines. He has, a front row seat to all of these important events that are taking place. He's observing the Napoleonic Wars, and he, like everyone else, is trying to figure out what is making Napoleon so successful and then counteract that to defeat Napoleon. Again, Clausewitz's career ended up not being as successful as it could have been. This is a double-edged sword in some ways. If his military career had been more successful, he might not have had more time to do his writing. But because it wasn't as successful as it could have been, then he did have that time. So maybe it ended up being for the best if one thinks that what he ended up writing was pivotal to studying military history and pivotal to military theory more generally. But again, he was very intelligent, he was incredibly innovative, he understood military affairs, and he really had a way of discussing it and describing it. But he wasn't as successful militarily, as I've said, because he had this suspicion that he had been in France a little bit too long between 1806 and 1808. And then he was in some way sort of marginalized because he had gone to the Russians. Now, of course, a lot of commanders had done that, and he had arguably a very good reason for doing so, and of course had in some way contributed to Napoleon's defeat, not singularly, certainly, but he had helped, most definitely. But all of these things sort of sidetracked his career, and he might have been able to become a Prussian general who did command troops in the field. Now you might say, how would someone that just served on general staffs become a commanding general? Well, in the Prussian system, that happened all the time. That's actually often where a lot of generals would come from, who started to actually command troops in the field, as they would rise to prominence through this general staff system, and then because they were respected and they had been present during decision-making, they were viewed as being able to command troops in the field. So that wouldn't have been out of the question that one day he could have been, a commander of Prussian troops in the field. But as it was, that's not where his career went, and because of that, arguably, we have on war. Because of what had gone on during the Napoleonic Wars, Clausewitz's active staff officer career was pretty much completely stalled. But people still acknowledged that he was an important intellectual, an important thinker about military theory and military affairs. So he was actually made head of the Kriegsakademie, that military academy that he himself had attended, knew when he went there. Now he was the head of it. Now what we know about his time there, based upon limited sources and some accounts of people that attended the school while he was there, he wasn't very visible. He didn't try to impact the curriculum too much. He didn't try to shape what was taught at the school or how it was taught. All of that, in his defense, was being shaped by the Prussian military, so he didn't have much power to do anything about any of that. He was mostly what we might call a backroom bureaucrat. He spent most of his time organizing the school and just making sure that it ran effectively. And again, from the accounts that we have of people that attended the school while he was there, he was always sort of in the background. They knew about him, but he didn't interact with people more than his position would require. Again, he wasn't trying to shape the curriculum or be a teacher or a tutor at the school, because instead he had given himself a new goal, and that goal was that he was going to write about the nature of war. He had a lot of free time because he had a really strong work ethic, and his job was not too overly taxing in terms of daily tasks, and so he was going to spend his free time writing about the true nature of war, which superficially seems like it might be an easy thing to do, but hopefully, as you'll learn, was anything but. And indeed, he spent the next 10 years of his life thinking about his theories of war and writing about his theories of war. In 1818, he actually wrote a note to himself because his wife was able to save a lot of his papers. He died fairly suddenly, so we have some of his papers and notes that exist. In 1818, he wrote to himself, quote, "It was my ambition to write a book that would not be forgotten after 2 or 3 years, and that might possibly be picked up more than once by those who are interested in the subject of war." So his goal is twofold. First, he wants to make sure that what he's writing about war doesn't just apply to war in his own time. He wants to get at the intrinsic nature of war, regardless of where it's being fought, who's fighting it, what they're fighting it with, and why the war is taking place in the first place. His belief was that the trappings of war may change, but intrinsically war itself does not. And so when he's talking about writing something that would not be forgotten after 2 or 3 years, he wanted to write something that was important and something that would have universal meaning regardless of the sort of historical circumstances. He also wanted to write it for those who are interested in the subject of war, So he doesn't just mean generals, officers in the Prussian army or the Russian army or the French or the British army. He wants to write about war for anyone interested in war. And this is part of that, more liberal arts education, is that he's starting to think of himself more as an intellectual as opposed to a military practitioner who's trying to just write about the ABCs of war to teach future military practitioners how to operate in the field. He also wrote that he felt previous theories, and this would include Jomini, because he would have, and we know he did, read Jomini as most military practitioners would have. So keep in mind that when he was writing these things, he's writing them having read Jomini. He felt that previous theories of war were, quote, absolutely useless, end quote, because most theories, quote, aimed at fixed values, but in war everything is uncertain, end quote. So war is an art. There aren't specific finite maxims that everyone can identify and learn and master and thus be good at war, because war is uncertain. Everything in war is uncertain. So this is why people often put Jomini and Clausewitz in opposition, and in some ways they're absolutely not, but fundamentally in some ways they absolutely are. He also wrote that his intention was to speak to those familiar with the subject. So again, he's writing to military practitioners, but also people that just generally study war, whereas Jomini was mostly writing to military practitioners. That was his audience. Clausewitz's goal, at least, was to write to anyone interested in the subject of war. This is the book that Clausewitz spent the next 10 years, indeed the last 10 years of his life, writing and revising and re-editing and revising again, and that is Vom Krieg, or On War. It's technically not Clausewitz's only publication, but it's certainly his most important and by far his most well-known. Technically, On War is made up of 8 books, although in modern parlance we would call these chapters. It's not like each book was a full book length in a series of 8. Again, today we would call these chapters. But when people talk about On War, they talk about the books rather than the 8 chapters. What makes Vom Krieg so difficult, but also so intriguing, and also such a matter of intense debate amongst military historians who discuss these things, is that it's incredibly complex, it's really, really dense, and at times it's contradictory. Assertions that Clausewitz makes in one place, he seems to contradict or somewhat disagree with in others. And of course, this is because the book was complete, but it wasn't really finished. He completed the book, all 8 books were written, at least to some degree, but he didn't finish it, he didn't revise the whole thing. So only really serious military theorists talk about books 2 through book 7. Everyone pretty much focuses on books 1 and 8, because those are the ones that were considered to be finished and fully revised. But I've even heard native German speakers say that Vom Krieg is easier to understand in English than it is in German, because it's just so complex and dense, and Clausewitz loved to use similes and metaphors to talk about things, although he says in On War that he doesn't like similes and metaphors because he is trying to be precise, but often feels that the only way to do that is to use simile and metaphor. So there's an internal contradiction right there of the many that exist. We wouldn't have On War at all if it were not for his wife Marie, because in 1831, Clausewitz was called back into military service, active military service. He contracted cholera and he died rather suddenly. But Marie knew that he'd been working on this book. Of course, he spent a lot of his free time working on it. They corresponded about it whenever they were apart. They probably would have discussed it extensively when they were together, which would have been most of the time, but when he traveled, they wrote to one another frequently. And as I mentioned previously, we have that correspondence. People can go and read it if they're interested. And in those letters, they talk about his ideas, and she gives him feedback, and he proposes new ideas, and she proposes things, and they talk a lot about what he wanted on war to be. And so when he died very suddenly, she decided it needed to be published. So she went into his office, she took his papers, she got one of his aides, and they worked on compiling On War, and she is the one responsible for publishing it. So we would not have On War if it were not for Marie von Clausewitz. The Prussian military didn't pay too much attention to vom Krieg at first. Neither did the German military when Germany was created as a state. There were people that read it, certainly. We know Jomini read it, for example, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. So we know people read it, but it was considered somewhat fringe, somewhat obscure. People didn't pay too awfully much attention to it initially. And in fact, it really didn't start to get more widespread attention into the 1860s and 1870s. And if you think about military education at the time, as I've explained it, that makes perfect sense, because Clausewitz was saying you can't create maxims of war. You can't break things down into component parts. And the whole thrust of On War is trying to describe this thing that he says is inherently indescribable. So it's very abstract and it's very complex. But then you have Jomini, who is writing book after book after book that's talking about specific tactics, specific strategies, methods that military practitioners can use in the field to achieve success. And so Jomini was what people focused on. That's why he was so popular and so widely read. And so something that was abstract and theoretical and internally contradictory and incredibly complex and dense, people didn't necessarily have the time for quite a long time, until the 1860s into the 1870s, when military culture started to change. We know that the first French and English translations were written in the 1870s and the 1880s, and the specifics of those translations have certainly varied over time, and we're going to talk about how translations actually can make a big difference when trying to understand the meaning of what people are trying to write. But those first translations existed in the 1870s and 1880s, and we know that the English in particular started to be quite interested in Clausewitz, mostly because they were trying to understand the Germans. So once this new powerful German state was created into the 1870s, the British, who were the premier world power at the time, were trying to understand the Germans and their thinking and their decision making, and On War was seen as an avenue for that goal. The Japanese actually created a translation in the late 19th century after the Meiji Restoration, and in fact, a really interesting anecdote is that the Germans formed a very close alliance with the Japanese. I wouldn't say alliance, it wasn't a formal military alliance actually, it was just a friendship, a camaraderie of sorts, because the Japanese hired European and American military officers to come and be advisors to help modernize the Japanese military and then help advise their own military academies that the Japanese were building. And the Germans actually brought copies of vom Krieg with them to give as gifts to the Japanese in the early 1900s, and the Japanese said, oh, we've had translations of this for decades, because they were very interested in these new vogue ideas that were starting to gain traction in the military intelligentsia. And in fact, we know that On War had a really big impact on the way that the Japanese were thinking, the Japanese high command, and their decision-making in the Russo-Japanese War. And of course, famously in the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese pretty soundly defeated the Russians, which no one expected. And so Clausewitz was just gaining more and more traction as Jomini was starting to be a little bit more marginalized, because people were starting to consider whether or not his ideas were outdated because of those specific maxims being considered outdated. As I said, the British in particular began paying attention to vom Krieg when they started to realize the Germans were a potential major future threat. So what states and militaries will do is they'll sit around and they'll think about who future enemies might be. And then they'll think about what wars against those enemies might be and what decisions the enemy might make in those wars. So it's all highly speculative and theoretical, but it's something that militaries do. The United States had a plan to go to war against the British prior to World War I, for example, very famously. They had a very intricate plan. They even war-gamed the Pacific War in World War II against the Japanese and predicted pretty much everything major that went on except for kamikaze attacks. So very common for militaries to do this. And so the British became really interested in on war when the British High Command, the British military, and the British government realized that the Germans were a potential future threat. And when Oxford military historians started contemplating on war, then it spread to the United States, and it just became more and more widely read and more revered. It was in the mid to late 20th century that Clausewitz really became highly popular in the United States. Really after World War II. It was the Cold War where Clausewitz really came into his own in terms of being respected as an important military theorist in American military circles. And this is because the Cold War was sort of more abstract, more complex, more nebulous. It was technically a Cold War, but then you have these quote-unquote hot conflicts around the world, and fighting a war without actually taking up arms in some ways was what the Cold War was all about. And so there were a lot of U.S. military theorists that started to sort of set Jomini aside, say, you know, we need to start paying attention to this Prussian military theorist, obscure Prussian theorist that is respected in academic circles, but doesn't seem to have much traction outside of that. And that is why into the 21st century, Clausewitz is considered one of the most important military theorists that has ever lived. The book on war is now considered one of the most widely read and respected military treatises ever written. Clausewitz is considered its quote-unquote brilliant author. And even if there are people that think Clausewitz is overrated, or think that people put too much stock in what he writes, or think that his approach is too abstract and too sort of, it lacks utility for military practitioners, even people in that school respect the importance of Clausewitz. And so if one wants to study military theory and one wants to understand warfare, in addition to reading Jomini, it's also important to read some Clausewitz. The leading scholar today on Clausewitz is a former Ohio State professor named Alan Beyerchen. Some years ago, Dr. Beyerchen wrote an article titled Clausewitz and Nonlinearity, which is free online, and if you ever want to bend your mind a little bit, I recommend you look it up and you give it a try. Beyerchen described Clausewitz this way, and I think it's the best way to really understand the essence of Clausewitz and why on war is the way it is. He said that Clausewitz was a romanticist who wanted to be enlightened. So in other words, Clausewitz believed in romanticism. He believed that there were things that were too difficult or complex or enigmatic to break down and categorize and explain in a scientific way, and war was one of those things. That's his big argument, is war is too complex to really linearize effectively, to understand scientifically, because at its heart it's not a science. But he wanted to be enlightened. That's what On War is about. He's trying to break down the components of war, categorize war into its specific sub-elements, define those sub-elements so that they can be reconstructed, and one can come out of On War understanding the nature of military affairs. That's what he was trying to do, and even superficially, if you look at Jomini's work and Clausewitz's work side by side, organizationally, they're very similar. There are different sections. Each section is trying to describe a certain aspect of war and break it down in the content of that section so that when one gets to the end of the book or of the chapter, they understand everything that's been covered in that element of discussing war. So they're trying to do the same thing, but Clausewitz is in this constant tension. On War is this constant tension because he's a romanticist who wants to be enlightened. He's doing something or trying to do something that he himself acknowledges is impossible. And I think that's one main reason that On War is as complex and difficult as it is. Clausewitz was also, like Jomini, living in the aftermath of Napoleon. In the intervening decades and centuries, I think it's easy to downplay or not appreciate how big of a deal Napoleon was in his own time. He ran roughshod over Europe for over a decade. He defeated European coalition after European coalition. And one can debate his personal foibles. One can say that he wasn't nearly as revolutionary as people felt he was at the time. Certainly not all of his ideas were novel. He took a lot of ideas that existed and reorganized them and created some new ideas. And he did all of that and was incredibly, incredibly successful for over a decade, which in military terms is quite a long period of time, especially being as dominant as he was. So in the aftermath of that, people were trying to figure out how he did it. Was it something that can't be taught? Something about him personally that made him successful? Was it something that he learned? Was it how he was educated? Was it the technology that he used? Was it specific tactics or strategies that he employed? People were trying to crack the code. And Jomini was trying to do that, as was Clausewitz, which is why in most military theory written in the aftermath of Napoleon, Napoleon's mentioned, if at least indirectly. Jomini references him directly, Clausewitz references him directly in many places, in addition to indirectly in a lot of other places. So always have to read military theory in the 19th century in light of that. And again, remember, he's trying to describe something that he himself acknowledges is so enigmatic as to be nearly indescribable. Something in particular that makes him somewhat entertaining at times, I'll put it that way, is that he actually says at times in On War that he hates similes and metaphors. He doesn't want to describe war using simile and metaphor, and yet he extensively uses simile and metaphor. And he's doing that because he's trying to describe something so abstract that the best way to get at it is simile and metaphor. But there are many difficulties given this practice. The big one being that translating this from German into English or German into any language makes simile and metaphor pretty difficult, because similes and metaphors rely on common understanding of meaning. So if you're comparing one thing to another thing, then you're assuming that the person that you're using the metaphor in discussion with understands the thing that you're comparing it to. So you have to have that common understanding, and Clausewitz was a late 18th, early 19th century military practitioner who grew up in Prussia and was writing in complex German. And so that understanding can be lost, it can be muddled when you translate from one language to another, or just when time passes. And so this is one thing people struggle with a lot, is that he uses metaphor and simile quite a lot, and so teasing out the meaning can be quite a challenge. Now you might say, why is it that he was so against prescriptive theory? We've talked about the deeper meaning, because he thought war lacked categorization. But we must also address why he felt it was so dangerous to categorize, to linearize. And the main reason was because he thought the more prescriptive one was, so the more specific one was about proper tactics in certain situations and how to cross that river and how to build that bridge and how to organize those troops into that formation, the more prescriptive one was, the more one was limiting themselves in the face of war's unpredictability. So in other words, if I teach you 10 ways to handle an enemy, and they come at you in way number 11, you've in no way prepared for that because you've only contemplated ways 1 through 10. It's sort of like Plato's allegory of the cave, or what people often say, and they overuse this phrase, thinking outside the box. If all you concentrate on is the box, you don't see the outside of it. You don't even see the boundaries. You don't know what you don't know, in essence. So by only preparing for a certain set of circumstances and outcomes, so Clausewitz would say, you're limiting yourself to everything outside of that. And because war is so unpredictable, and it's so difficult and complex and enigmatic and non-linear, to use Dr. Byershin's phraseology, then you're going to probably lose because you are trying to prepare for the unpreparable. You're limiting yourself to potential possibilities, and that can lead to defeat. At the same time, he's writing on war because he knew that military practitioners needed and they wanted. Jomini was popular for a reason. Military practitioners wanted specific guidelines and tools. They wanted to be able to effectively wage war and win war. People are going to go to war. They want to win war. So how are they going to do that? They need to be taught how to do that. That's why everybody paid so much attention to Napoleon. So he understands that utility. He's the commandant of the Kriegsacademy. He understands the reason for prescriptive works of military theory. So he's trying to make these two things work together, but it's like putting a square peg into a round hole, essentially. Now you might say, Dr. Douglas, why are you going into this detail about all of these difficulties and this tension? Well, that's because On War is difficult to read and it's difficult to understand. And if you're going to read it, you're going to have difficulty with it. But it's important to understand that everyone has difficulty with On War. There are very smart theorists that have lived before now and are living today and will continue to live into the future who are far smarter than me, that are far smarter than you, that have read On War and debate the meaning. People debate and have debated the meaning of On War since it was published. So if you're reading it and you get confused, that's fine. That's expected. What you're really picking up on is this inherent tension that Clausewitz himself was wrestling with, which is why he never actually finished the book. Now I want to touch upon some of Clausewitz's more famous quotes and assertions as an entree into On War more generally. Perhaps his most famous assertion is that, quote, war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale. Now, right there, off the bat, one of the most famous arguments Clausewitz is known for uses a metaphor. He's comparing war to a duel. And then, also right off the bat, we encounter an issue with translation. Again, if we're trying to understand what Clausewitz is saying, we have to understand intrinsically what he means by the words that he uses. And metaphors are one of the challenges, as I talked about a moment ago. So famously, he supposedly wrote, war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale. But I indicate wrestling match because of the statement following it. Countless matches go to make up war, but a picture of it as a whole can be formed by imagining a pair of wrestlers. Each tries through physical force to compel the other to do his will. His immediate aim is to throw his opponent in order to make him incapable of further resistance. When Clausewitz wrote that war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale, for the word duel, he used the German word Zweikampf. And Zweikampf probably more accurately means wrestling match as opposed to duel. So when you see people quote Clausewitz, they often say war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale because the most popular translation that exists today uses the word duel. But wrestling match is more accurate. And in the context of what Clausewitz wrote, wrestling match is probably the better word there. Now you might say, Dr. Douglas, who cares whether it's a duel or it's a wrestling match? Well, Clausewitz is trying to describe something that's really complex, and he's doing it in a really complex way. And like I said, if he's going to use metaphor, we have to understand exactly what type of metaphor he's trying to use. He's not comparing war to a duel. Think about what a duel is. A duel in his time would have been two people fighting with swords or potentially two people fighting with guns, with handheld pistols. And the implication metaphorically is that the two sides are not in physical contact. There's something in between them, and they're at something of a distance, especially if a duel was being fought with pistols. More likely in his time, the duel would have been fought with swords, which means they're using some type of instrument, and they're keeping each other at slightly a little bit of a distance. Now compare the image of a duel to the image of a wrestling match. Think of two bodies in immediate physical contact that are forcing one another to compel the other to do his will. So if we're trying to get at the heart of war, it's more accurate from Clausewitz's point of view to call it a wrestling match as opposed to a duel. Now superficially, one could even say, who really cares? The same basic idea stands. But if you really want to understand Clausewitz and you want to understand what he's trying to say, it's more accurate to say that war is a wrestling match as opposed to a duel. War is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. There you go. An act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. In some ways, it's not that different from Jomini. Jomini was talking about mass and concentrating mass, but Jomini was much more literal, much more practical in a sense, and Jomini is being far more abstract. Clausewitz is being far more abstract here, rather. So, depending upon how you want to view their theories, this is the same sort of basic argument, but one is the enlightened way to say things and to present that information. The other is the romanticist way. This is another famous phrase of Clausewitz, perhaps his second or first most famous, depending upon how you view the dual phrase. War is nothing but the continuation of policy by other means. And sometimes you'll see this written as war is nothing but the continuation of politics by other means. And certainly there is a lot of debate about whether Clausewitz meant policy or politics. But the intrinsic idea that's important to take away is that war is a continuation of politics or policy. Think back to Jomini. Jomini said that war and politics and policy are separate. They're separate entities that do not overlap. They interact, but they don't overlap. Here, Clausewitz is saying that war is a tool, it's a continuation of politics and policy by other means. So Jomini is saying they're separate. Clausewitz is saying, nope, they're not separate. And in fact, war is a tool of politics and policy. Battle is the decisive means in war, and violence is inherent in war. So this is one of the assertions that some historians argue puts Clausewitz in his historical context. He was living in the early 19th century, and he could not necessarily conceptualize war taking place without battles, because in his age, war involved battles, maneuvering to avoid battle or maneuvering to engage in battle. And so he couldn't necessarily conceptualize war taking place without battles. Now, some other theorists would come back and say, well, under Clausewitz's definition, wars have to involve battle. So if you're talking about something that doesn't involve battle, it's not actually war. But again, there's debate about all of these things, so you can take this statement however you would like. But the important thing to take away in addition to that is that violence is inherent to war. So from the Clausewitzian point of view, the use of the term war in a more abstract sense to refer to things that don't involve violence is not accurate. War is not a mindless act. Intelligence and violence are not opposites. This is a really important thing if we're trying to get at the inherent nature of war, because Clausewitz is saying, as was Jomini, that the trappings of war may change, technology, location, people involved, but the inherent nature of war doesn't change. And something that people tend to think about war, certainly I can tell you this as a professor and a specialist in military history, is people tend to think that war is the result of sort of mindless behavior, that if people were really thinking about things, if people were really considering things properly or behaving intelligently or reasonably, they wouldn't go to war. That's sort of the inherent assumption, that war is mindless. It's the result of passion, it's the result of lack of control, etc., etc. And what Clausewitz is saying is that's not true. That intelligence and violence are not opposites. They can be opposites, but they're not inherently opposite. That some people go into war with incredible forethought and deep planning and rational thought, at least from his point of view. And so, intelligence, violence, not inherently opposite. Two other things he's very well known for are the concepts of friction and fog. Friction, think of tires on the road. You put tires on your car and you drive your car, and over time, friction wears away the rubber on your tires and you have to get new tires. What Clausewitz was talking about with friction is this idea that that's what happens to militaries in war. Even if a military wins a war, they're still subject to friction. They're going to lose time, they're going to lose resources, they're going to lose manpower and financial resources. All of those things that could have gone to something else are going to be diminished because of engagement in war. Even if one wins war, friction is still a factor. And fog, he meant figuratively and literally. But really, he means this figuratively. He's talking about fog in a metaphorical sense. The idea that in war, you can't know everything. You can't see everything. You can't predict everything. And it's friction and it's fog. And these two forces in concert bring chance and uncertainty into play. And that's why you can't have prescriptive theory, because chance and uncertainty, unpredictability, nonlinearity are the product of friction and fog. And if you try to predict, that's when you lose sight of all potential possibilities. Things like laws of war or cultural conventions in war do not change its inherent character or nature. These are comparatively superficial. So this is something that military theorists have certainly debated, and I know students like to contemplate a lot when they talk about definitions of war across time, because one has to understand that war has occurred since before civilization existed. How far before civilization existed is certainly a matter of debate, but we do know that there's evidence that even before humans organized themselves into settled societies, war was something that occurred, and war has occurred certainly ever since the emergence of civilization. And it's occurred across time, across culture, across the globe. It doesn't matter what time period, what geographical location in, it doesn't matter what tools are being used, civilizations and societies have engaged in war. And so what Clausewitz is saying is that despite the superficial trappings of the ancient Roman Empire using shields and swords and the modern US military using planes and drones, it might make one think that that means the war waged in the modern era is inherently different than the war waged by the ancient Romans. Clausewitz is saying that's not true. That stuff's superficial. Laws of war, cultural conventions, weapons used, all of that is superstructure. The infrastructure of war, the inherent nature of war, that doesn't change. All of that other stuff, the trappings of time and place and culture and weaponry, all that stuff is superficial. War itself, in its very nature, that doesn't change, according to Clausewitz. And then finally, he argues that defense is the stronger form of warfare. If you have two forces in opposition, the force on the defense is inherently stronger than the force on the offense. And if you think about one country invading another country, usually the country on the defensive has the advantage because all they have to do is continue to survive. Whereas the invading force, all of the onus is on them to achieve success and completely defeat the force of the country or the territory that they're invading. So these are certainly not all of the things that Clausewitz is known for, but these are a lot of the big things that are often bandied about when people talk about Clausewitzian theory. The final thing that Clausewitz is well known for is something called the Trinity. Clausewitz argued that war was made up of these three components, these three elements. And I'm not going to say basic elements because they are definitely not basic. Historians and military theorists have debated exactly what the meaning of these three elements are. And I'm going to describe them as best I can, but keep in mind these are heavily, heavily debated. The first in the Trinity is government, sometimes referred to as politics, reason, and intelligence. So this would be that politics by other means element, the idea that war is made up of a body of people where intelligence and government and politics are a factor. The second is the military. This also involves calculation, game of chance, and odds, because the military is going to involve tactical and strategic organization. It also involves calculating and trying to understand potential actions of the enemy. But when trying to guess what the enemy is going to do, it's basically a game of chance. It's about odds. What are the odds that your enemy is going to do X, Y, or Z? And then how are you going to counter that with A, B, and C? The final is the people. And this is also one of the most abstract elements of all of this, because the people also includes things like hate and enmity and primal violence and passion. Because if war were all logic, people might not necessarily be willing en masse to get together and try to inflict violence on an enemy. There has to be, so Clausewitz argues, the people, emotion, passion. There has to be hate or enmity. There has to be an element of primal violence and passion, because that's what's going to motivate people to overcome the challenges of war and the difficulties of war, and of course the inherent threat of death. When one goes into war, there's a mutual threat of violence, and so one has to not only be willing to be killed, one has to be willing to kill. That is part of war. And so what Clausewitz argued is that he needed to develop a theory, and that theorists needed to develop a theory that maintains a balance between these three tendencies, like an object suspended between three magnets. Boom, simile. So he argues that these three elements make up war, and that war is always suspended like a magnet between these three things. And so when one is trying to understand war, they have to understand these components. But that is not a simple thing because, as I've said, historians debate exactly the meaning of each element of the Trinity, how the Trinity interacts, each element interacts with the other, which is more important in each given circumstance, and really exactly what Clausewitz meant with each term that he used, because there's a lot of debate about basic meanings of words here. So therefore, one's task is to develop a theory that maintains a balance between these three tendencies, the government, the military, and the people, like an object suspended between three magnets. So overall, I've talked about Jomini and I've talked about Clausewitz. I've discussed their military backgrounds and their life experiences, and then how these things informed their careers as military theorists. I then touched upon some basic but important elements of their theories, some of which would support the argument that these two individuals are mostly in opposition when it comes to their beliefs regarding the inherent nature of war. Indeed, at the outset of the lecture, I presented Jomini as a leader in the school that argues that war is a science, while with Clausewitz, I discussed at some detail how, at the heart of things, he believed that war is an art. But are they really in such opposition? Can we really break them down into these basic categories that don't overlap? And far more importantly, is war only in one school? or the other school? Well, as I've also discussed, sorta, but also not really. In fact, Jomini once wrote, "War in its ensemble is not a science, but an art. Strategy, particularly, may indeed be regulated by fixed laws resembling those of the positive sciences, but this is not true of war viewed as a whole. Among other things, combats may be mentioned as often being quite independent of scientific combinations, and they may become essentially dramatic, personal qualities and inspirations, and 1,000 other things, frequently being the controlling elements. The passions which agitate the masses that are brought into collision, the warlike qualities of these masses, the energy and talent of their commanders, the spirit, more or less martial, of nations and epochs, in a word, everything that can be called the poetry and metaphysics of war, will have a permanent influence on its results." Conversely, Clausewitz once wrote, "Force, to counter opposing force, equips itself with the inventions of art and science." He also wrote, "But we must go on to say that, strictly speaking, war is neither an art nor a science. To take these concepts as a point of departure is misleading in that it has unintentionally caused war to be put on par with other arts and sciences, resulting in a mass of incorrect analogies." So on the whole, there is some overlap. Perhaps war is part art and part science. Yet this doesn't change that intrinsically these two theorists viewed war very differently in many ways, and that difference of opinion makes itself clear in how they wrote about war. What's more, Jomini did not really think too much of Clausewitz, either because he didn't value such an abstract approach, he didn't understand on war, which he wouldn't be the only one, or maybe he was just too protective of his own status as a premier military theorist. Each is equally possible. Jomini in their lifetimes also got the last say because while the two men never met face to face, they did read each other's works, and because Jomini outlived Clausewitz, he was able to have the last say in print. Specifically, he once wrote of Clausewitz, "One cannot deny to General Clausewitz great learning and a facile pen, but this pen, at times a little vagrant, is about all too pretentious for a didactic discussion, the simplicity and clearness of which ought to be its first merit. Besides that, the author shows himself by far too skeptical of military sciences. His first volume is but a decimation against all theory of war, whilst the two succeeding volumes, full of theoretical maxims, proves that the author believes in the efficacy of his own doctrines, if he does not believe in those of others. As for myself, I own that I have been able to find in this learned labyrinth but a small number of luminous ideas and remarkable articles." In the greater historical narrative, Clausewitz could be considered to have emerged the winner, but we're not trying to determine a winner, as it were. We're trying to understand the inherent nature of war, which both Clausewitz and Jomini, in their very different approaches, attempted to do. So is war an art? Is it a science? Or is it a little bit of both? Whatever the truth is, indeed if there is a truth, it's up to you. Have a good day.